We had a guy one time who claimed to have turned his life around. Really, it was a real radical story. He'd been a drug dealer. He was friends with somebody in our youth group. It turns out he was still dealing. He was just lying to impress some girls. We're at a Super Bowl party that year, and he was high. He started to argue with our youth pastor, who had been an Army Ranger for 7 or 8 years. The drug dealer tries to come at the Ranger, and before the guy knew what happened, our youth pastor had him on the ground, basically in a headlock. Welcome to youth group.
Damn, I'm glad I didn't peak in high school, 'cause my best days will be in the past. I know, looking back, it ain't all bad, but damn, I'm glad I didn't peak in high school.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Unlearning Youth Group. We're the podcast where we take a look at all the things we learned back in youth group and find the good, unlearn the bad, and figure out where the heck we go from here. We haven't met yet. My name is Jonathan Carone, and I'm joined, as always, by our co-host, Eric Williams. Eric, go ahead and say hey to the people.
Hey, what is up? I'm excited for today's topic. Let's start.
Today, we are talking about essentially Christian cuss words. Bigger picture than that, it's the idea that we were taught as kids growing up, and we also taught this when we were all teaching youth group, that the words we said mattered, not the intent. And Eric, did you ever see the Tripp and Tyler Shoot Christian Say video?
Are you kidding me? That video gave me life for about 10 solid years. I love it so much.
And as someone who went to a Christian college, that hit everything. And speaking of Christian college, the motivation for this episode, I don't know if I told you this when we were talking these out or not, but I went to Liberty, which is the world's largest Christian university. Because we're a diploma mill online, and that's what we do. So we can claim that.
This podcast is not sponsored by Liberty, just FYI.
It is not.
That was not an ad.
A month or two ago, I saw on a Liberty account, some dude responded to something he didn't like with "frick you."
Oh.
Like, he thought he was like, because he said "frick you," he didn't actually mean the other F you.
Oh my God.
And that's what we were taught, is that if we say the Christian cuss words, then it's okay. It doesn't matter that in our heart that we just said go F off.
Right.
But we said go frick off.
Yeah.
So it was better.
Well, I was actually debating in that intro saying I'm freaking excited to be here, but I want to make sure that we, didn't opt people out right away before getting into the topic.
So what was your favorite Christian cuss word?
Yeah, I love seeing, well, this is what I like seeing is when people now in the age of texting will text OMG, but then they'll put a parentheses and OSH and parentheses. So to make sure that everyone knows that they're saying, oh my gosh, instead of, oh my God, as if that was like,
if you're talking to a youth group girl and she types OMW, you don't know if she means on my way or oh my word, because that was the thing is switching, as if Jesus was not the word incarnate. So saying oh my word is the exact same thing as saying oh my God.
Yeah, exactly.
I think my favorite, because I spent a lot of time online, was spelling out effing EFFING.
Or leave off the G and just put a little apostrophe after the N. So it's
effing. Like, when me and my wife first started dating, like I would even say that a lot. I'd say effing a lot. And she's like, you got to tone that down. That's a little bit much. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, well it's because the F word is my favorite cuss word if I were to cuss.
Right.
So I can't let myself say it or else it comes out every other word.
Well, and then that Tripp and Tyler video that we talked about, man, one of my favorite parts is when he's like, that guy's really teeing me off. I'm going to kick his A. And so like you're putting the initial out there anyway. And so everybody who knows the word anyway. And so it's like and what's been surprising for me and probably for you, because I know that you work with secular companies. I say secular. That sounds so secular. You work with secular companies as well. But when you're around people who didn't grow up in the Christian faith, or who are not, I would say Bible Belt Christians, cuss words are not a big deal. And so so to tell youth in youth culture, and for me, I've said before, I didn't start going to church till 6th grade regularly. So you better believe 4th and 5th grade, Eric was already learning and using cuss words, not around my parents, obviously. But so it's a weird culture shift in this whole thing, because it's like we're called to be set apart, but at the same time, you walk around a lot of major cities or environments and cuss words are just a way of life.
I remember in 4th or 5th grade, I was going to daycare at the church my grandpa was a pastor at. So everybody knew I was the pastor's grandkid. And, 4th and 5th grade is when you start figuring out what the words are. You don't know how to use them yet, but you know that they're bad.
Right.
And so you just drop them wherever and they don't make any sense. And I remember someone's like, well, how can you be a Christian if you're saying all those words?
Right.
And my response was, well, maybe that demon that was in you came into me and that's why I'm saying them. And I'm like, why is 10-year-old Jonathan thinking and talking like that? Like, cuss words mean you're possessed by a demon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's just so much around language that I think we got wrong when we were growing up. I'm reading a book right now. I forget the exact title of it, but it's basically about how our context and our culture in the West and in America really impact how we view scripture and how we get some of the stuff wrong.
Right.
And in it, they told a story of how this guy traveled to Scotland and he met up with a pastor and his wife in Scotland. And that Scottish pastor was telling him a story of how they had met someone the week before and how the wife just got off the plane and dropped the F word. And they were so shocked that she would just like this Christian pastor's wife would drop the F word when she was talking about it. And they kept talking. And the guy, like, he's like, I know that woman. She would never say that. And they couldn't figure out what it was. Do you know what the F word is to Christians in Scotland?
No.
Fanny.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh. I was about to say that.
The woman said, I'm just going to park my fanny right here.
I was literally going to tell you that story because it's the same thing as like when somebody said, because I went to England right after college and I was talking about fanny packs and they looked at me like I was like a pariah.
And so what I learned is if our British listeners, if we have any of those, you're probably thinking we're cussing up a storm right here. But in Great Britain, fanny is another word for lady bits. And it does not mean your booty. So they thought she was using a derogatory term for I'm going to set my blankety blank here on this chair when she was meaning I'm going to set my booty on this chair. And so that in and of itself is an example of how the words we use are so fleeting.
Right.
The idea that there are certain words we need to avoid. Yes, but it's not because of the reason we were taught.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's same example for I've got 2 boys, they're 8 and 9. And so right now we're in the middle of, what words do you say? How do you talk to people? And, I was laughing about this with my wife the other day because they have internally in our house determined that the word duh is a bad word. That is a cuss word. That is a worse cuss word than any other cuss word that we say because, whatever, or they don't know other cuss words, right? And so they have internally decided that if you say duh, even if it's meant to be derogatory or funny or anything like that, as soon as I say that word, they stop me and they say, Daddy, that's a bad word and you cannot say that in our house. And it's like, so to your point, we assign the values to the words and it's not actually the words themselves that matter.
So again, if you're new with us, it's only the second episode, but so we'll go back to this. Each week we introduce the topic like we just did, and then we're going to talk about what was bad with that, where do we get it wrong, and then later in the show we're going to talk about where do we get it right, what was the good intention behind that bad approach, and then where do we go from here? How do we take the good and use it to move us forward? So Eric, as we go into the episode, what was wrong about the Christian cuss word culture? The idea that that the words didn't matter, or that the words were the most important, that the intentions didn't matter. Where did we get that wrong?
Yeah, I think it starts off, and if you haven't listened to the last episode on kind of fear and hell-based hell-based evangelism, you're going to have to go back and listen to it. Same situation where we've put the focus on the wrong thing, and it's really becoming about your behavior modification instead of actually changing the heart behind something. So in this case, it has nothing to do with how you feel when you're saying this thing. It's all about making sure that you don't do or say the wrong thing that may be inappropriate or somebody somewhere arbitrarily decided was inappropriate. What do you think?
I think it's easier to teach a bunch of teenagers what words are bad than it is to develop a theological understanding of how to use our language.
Yes. Well, and the thing that I think we need to address with the idea that we're talking about these things that we've learned in youth group or in student ministry or that 6th through 12th grade time frame is, yes, when we were taught these things, our brains really couldn't comprehend a lot of these deeper ethical issues. And we really needed some concrete examples, like especially when you're 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, saying like, hey, I'm going to give you the concept and you need to figure out how your behavior reflects to that is not going to work. And so when you tell a kid, do not say these words, why? These words are bad. Okay, right? Do not do this thing. Why? This thing is bad. And it just kind of continues on. And I don't think that youth culture does a great job, or did a great job, I would say, and again, when I was leading it, of switching that and saying, hey, you were taught that then. This is what you need to know about it now, and you need to wrestle with, the intent, the heart, the other things behind it. It's not just the words, and we're teaching you in a new way because your brain can actually comprehend a different way of learning now.
Yeah, and in Ephesians, Paul says to avoid obscenity. And in our culture, it was easier to just say, hey, these are the words that are obscenities. We defined what those were.
Yes.
Other places in the Bible, obscenity is described differently. And we've been taught not to let any unwholesome talk come out of our mouth, not to do anything out of selfish ambition or conceit, and to, in humility, count others more significant than ourselves. We were taught the words as the obscenities, but we were never taught the ideas behind them, that there's some other theological ideas that Jesus and the apostles talk about and teach us that go into what makes an obscenity, as well as culture. Because my old senior pastor told me a story of how he was in Australia and he was standing next to a guy who was worshiping his heart out during service. And like, this guy, you could tell was full on follower of Jesus, was doing it the right way, and was honestly and actively seeking to follow Jesus. And then they walked out of service, and the first thing the guy did was drop an F-bomb. It took my old pastor by surprise. Like it smacked him in the face, but then he realized in Australia the F word's just a comma.
Right.
Like it's not nearly as big of a deal. So we were taught the words, which is, I think, part of it. We were not taught the context and the meaning behind the words.
Yeah. And I think we're set up that way theologically as we read the Bible anyway, because, if you do, okay, we're going to do a Bible in a year reading plan, start in Genesis, make your way through. Well, a couple of weeks, months into it, you start to get into the rules section, right? Now you're into Leviticus. Now you're into some of these other areas where God is saying, do not do these things. And that obviously a lot of that stuff has been fulfilled and has been changed through the New Testament and Jesus. And the reason why I think we get confused on the words aspect is because we look at it for a lot of theological things. You look back and you say, don't eat these things. Well, why? You know what I mean? And then later on in the New Testament, God says, hey, don't call the things unclean that I've now called clean. And, and these different hand washing rituals and stuff like that. And why did they have you do those things? And so when you take a time to go through some of these rules and some of these Old Testament laws and understand the why behind it, it's not because God circled something and say, don't touch this. Even the tree of good, of the knowledge of good and evil, God said, your eyes are going to be open to some things that you just don't need your eyes open to now. And you're going to trust in things that you do not need to trust in. And ultimately you need to trust in me, and we need to establish boundaries here. So it's the same thing with the words. It's like, why are you not saying these things? There's a heart issue behind it that God wants more so, that is just hard to write down in a book. And you really have to kind of wrestle through that.
Well, and on top of that, it gets back to your point with 4th and 5th graders, and like with my kindergartner, like right now as a child, I have to tell her, don't do this because it's against the rules.
Yes.
And as she gets older, I will teach her other things. Paul said, when I was a child, I thought like a child. Then I basically grew up and I had to change my thinking. And as we are now older in our 20s, our 30s, maybe even some people in their 40s and 50s are listening to this, we have to change our thinking past what we were taught as children.
Yes.
And now grow up our theology and become adults in that.
And not change in a bad way. That's what I want to make sure people know. Not like change like what you did before was wrong, but go to like 2.0, go to 3.0. Think about anything that you've learned. If you don't progress into the next stage of it, you'll never actually master it. So this is like building blocks. You're not saying, hey, let's not do addition anymore now that we're doing calculus. You still need addition, but now we're doing more advanced thinking in that same subject.
It's moving from McDonald's cheeseburgers to like great artisanal cheeseburgers on really good bread. It's just it's the next evolution as we get older. And but all right, so let's move into the back half of the episode. Eric, what did we get right? What was the good intention underlying the bad approach? We hit on it just a little bit, but let's dive into that a little bit more. What did we get right about this approach that we were taught as kids?
Well, listen, first of all, there's a way that we should be acting, and there's a way that we should be conducting ourselves in public. And as Christians, there's even more of a scrutiny on that as well. And, as much as I really don't like the phrase lose my witness, as if you can, somehow you make one mistake and now nobody's going to trust you about Jesus. There is a sense of having that authority to be able to conduct yourselves in such a way that people want to believe you. They want to follow you. They want to know why you're doing that. And so I get that when it comes to not being obscene and not doing those things. I think that's great. I also think that, like we've talked about, when there is a way that we're teaching young people, don't say this word because it's a bad word, right? And then there should be more teaching later on. And I think when you're doing the discipleship model right with students, especially, and you continue into college and you become kind of friends in young adulthood, then you can work with them through and teach them why and kind of walk through some of those deeper issues. But in this day and age when, people are much more mobile and you may not have those long-term relationships, something gets lost in translation. But the way you conduct yourself is true in public, as well as, the things that you say reflect what's actually going on inside.
Yeah, I think we got the first step right. We laid the basics down to tell people, hey, our words do matter. Like there are words that will offend people and that are wrong that we shouldn't say. And that was good.
Right.
It was, the follow-up, I think, is where the 2.0, like you mentioned, is where we may have gotten it wrong. But what we did get right was setting the idea that our words do matter, that it's important to think about what we're saying. James says the tongue reflects the heart. So, I mean, these are ideas that are very important that we laid the groundwork on. I just think that as we move forward, we never went to 2.0. And maybe that's because we graduated and went to college and we got busy thinking about other things. But we never went to 2.0 with a conversation of, yes, my words matter, but God looks at my heart for everything. So as we think about where we go from here, I think that's the piece we have to look at. And a couple years ago, I wrote a blog post about, I called it the, what did I call it? The less than definitive guide to cussing as a Christian. Because I do think we are allowed to say certain words in certain situations, depending on who we're around and the motivation behind it. And the three things I laid out for, as we use our language, as we think about this, 3 questions to ask ourselves before we drop words that in whatever culture we're in would be considered cuss words. The first one is, why am I using that language? The Bible's pretty clear that Jesus is more concerned about our motivations than our actual actions. And so before we drop the F-bomb, is it because we're trying to be rebellious, or is it because we're mad? Is it to tear someone down? Or is it because a well-placed F-bomb can make an okay joke, an incredible joke, and you're trying to cheer up your friend?
Yeah.
I mean, those are 2 totally different motivations. I led a college retreat a few years back, And one of my former students in high school who I was really close to, she was there. And it was Saturday night, and she was wrestling with a bunch of stuff and trying to live up to expectations. She was a freshman in college at the time. And I remember I was like, screw the expectations. And she goes, screw them. I was like, you can even get a little more emphatic if you need to. And she looked at me like, did you just give me permission to say what I think you told me to say? And I was like, go. And she goes, F them.
Right.
And it was the most righteous F-bomb I've ever heard in my life. And I think Jesus smiled in that moment. I can't say for sure,
right,
but it was because she was finally starting to realize that she's called to live up to what Jesus expects of her, not what her friends or her family or other people expect of her. So I think in that situation, it was okay.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a couple of different things too, especially in that example. Is like there's a difference between when we're talking about, and this is kind of maybe an archaic term, but curse words versus cussing versus swearing, and where does all that come from? So, definitely when you're saying, hey, do not curse someone else. So like basically calling upon God to do something, right? So, God, dang that person to hell, right? Or whatever, right? Like you should not. To heck. Yeah. The HE double hockey sticks. Yeah. Wow. But like, so.
Hey, I'm going to interrupt real quick. Did you ever flick off the devil when you were a kid? Because that was the only acceptable way to use your middle finger. No. I just thought of that. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, like I said, but by the time I was actually a Christian and going to church, I was already flicking off people and things because it was never a problem. It wasn't a problem until I was in 6th grade.
I would flick off the floor, and it'd be my way of flicking off the devil if I was really mad.
Just because you could do that. So anyway, like actually, I agree. Like, yeah, you shouldn't be calling upon the power of God to do things that are not within His nature, right? So, and you may not be thinking about that when you're cussing people out or cussing about people. So that's one thing. The other thing is like to say vulgarities, which I would say you could look through the Bible, and Paul said some things that were vulgar. Jesus said something that could be considered close to things that were emphatic language. Moses, Saul, Isaiah. There are things
before let's not jump over that. You're talking about when Jesus called people dogs, right?
He called them dogs, yeah. But he also in Matthew 15:17, he talks about us all. He says a poop joke, basically.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the type of things we're talking about we have to wrestle with.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the key is to me, there's a difference. Like cuss words are cuss words, but it's how you're using them. And, I think what we need to look through at Christians is, the way we treat people matters. And so, like your friend saying, F the expectations, she's not saying F you, Jonathan, right? Or F this person, or this person is a whatever. She's not saying something that's disparaging against someone else. And I think there's a different line to, having emphatic language that may be considered strong and may be considered, that if you're using that in the right context, to me, I'm like, I think Jesus is up there, if not saying, like you said, maybe he's not smiling, but I think he's like, yeah, okay, I don't really, there's more important things to worry about than whether or not you said that in that company right there. So I think you got to separate out. Are you actually calling upon the power of God to do something that's not within God's nature, as in cursing someone or swearing an oath when they're talking about cursing or swearing? Or are you using obscene language in a way that's in context or is out of context? Or are you using that language to tear other people down? I think those are different aspects that we all need to wrestle with individually, as opposed to just saying swear words are bad.
Totally. The second question that in the blog post a couple years ago that I wanted to hit on today is the question of who am I around? And I think I hit on this earlier in the episode, the idea of doing nothing out of selfish ambition to count others more significant than ourselves. That means that we're commanded by Scripture to honor and respect the people around us. Paul said, if it offends my brother to eat meat, I'm not going to eat meat. And so if we are around other Christians or even anyone in general who find vulgar language, cussing, whatever you want to define it as, offensive, it's our job not to, like, it would be a sin in that moment to cuss, I believe.
Yep.
Because we are putting ourselves and our desire to say that word above others. And the example I would use is I've got a friend named Patty, and Patty's an incredible woman who I have always enjoyed being around But we see the idea of language and cussing differently. Patty thinks that, like maybe even some people listening to this, and probably most in our parents' generation, that Christians should not cuss at any point, ever.
Yep.
And while I disagree with her, I respect her enough to, when I'm around her, to put her beliefs and convictions as more significant than mine. And because of that, I refuse to say anything that's anywhere close to being vulgar around Patty. Whereas if I'm with my friends who I know feel the same as me, I'm going to be a little less guarded because I know 4-letter words aren't going to offend them as much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is adjusting. And I think it's going to be a common theme throughout many of the topics that we have about really being strategic and understanding when you're going to do certain things and when you're not going to do certain things, and in which context. It's that idea of a scalpel versus a baseball bat. It's like right now, instead of saying you can't do this ever, anytime, I don't think this is one of those issues that it's you can't do this ever, anytime. But as a Christian, out of my love for others, I should refrain from doing things that may be acceptable, like whatever language I'm using, in order to show love to one another. And I mean, that's a big thing in culture over 2020, is like, what are the actions that you have that you're like, well, I don't really have to do this because of my freedoms, but because I want to show love for someone else, I'm going to intentionally restrict myself, or I'm going to intentionally do this. And so that's something I agree with on the cuss word aspect too. Yeah. Around certain people, I'm going to be even more cognizant of what I say, because if someone gets offended by me saying, oh my God, right, then I'm going to make sure that around those people, if I know that, I'm going to be way more careful when I say it, and make sure I text them OMG, open parentheses, OSH, close parentheses.
And that's just a way of loving people well.
Correct.
And at the end of the day, that's what we're called to do almost as much or more than anything else, is to love our neighbors as ourselves.
Yes.
And so to do that, it's an easy way to do things. And so before we get out of here, I want to hit the last one. And Eric, you mentioned this earlier, but where am I at and what's going on? We got to be aware of our surroundings, and there are places that will go where there's no way to know who's around us. So for example, this podcast, I don't know who is listening to this right now. I don't know if you are offended, you, the listener, are offended by hearing cuss words. So that's why
they turned it off after we said Fanny. Remember, like they're in Europe, they turned it off after we said Fanny. Yeah.
But when me and Eric were talking about like what we were going to do with this podcast, we talked about like, do we want to cuss or do we not want to cuss? And in a conversation between the two of us, we might drop a word or two here and there, but we don't know who's listening to this. Mm-hmm. So out of respect, like the last point and this one, we don't know. So we can't predict how they feel. So we've got to defer to not doing it.
Yeah. Doing the most loving thing possible. What is the most loving thing possible for the situation? Yeah.
And often that is deferring and putting aside our preferences for what may be the cultural preference as well. Mm-hmm. So if you're out in public, if you're at church, if you're depending on where you are, like you should probably use a little restraint.
Yep.
And part of that is people already have a bad view of Christians anyways. So to give them another reason to dismiss us before they even get to know us, that's just not good for the gospel strategically. Right. And it's not worth it. It's that joke or that complaint is not worth it to possibly negatively impact someone else's view of the gospel.
Yep. Yeah. I think that's the big answer for where do we go from here is let's not focus on the words necessarily, but focus on loving others with our words. How can we love others with our words? It's not always going to be easy, and loving others with our words isn't always going to be not swearing, because I think there are times where in moments of extreme grief or anger or something else, to show support for someone else, you might drop an F-bomb and say, yeah, F those expectations that other people have put on you, right? F that inappropriate way that you've been thinking about how God thinks about you, or even poor little 4-year-old Jonathan, using a middle finger towards the floor, right? Like F the devil. Like in some of those cases,
I think Jesus legitimately laughed at that.
I think
he's like, "Oh man,
that.
that's cute. Look at that kid."
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, if you had a older sibling, cousin, or your parents or whatever come in, and if they flip the bird down to the floor too, I think that's probably an okay thing too, because it's like, yeah, you know what, we're in this together, and we're not being obscene towards each other. We're not saying it's okay in different situations, but sometimes as a show of solidarity in appropriate moments, or a sign where you really need to emphasize a point that's important, then yeah, you know what, the language might be different, but in other cases, because you love someone else, love and restraint is going to win the day.
So that's a great place for us to stop today. Eric, before we get out of here, can you tease what's coming next week?
Yeah. Oh man. If you have ever been heard of a purity ring, if you ever did the sticky note example, if someone passed around a rose in your youth group or a dollar coin, then next week you're going to want to hear about purity culture. So get ready for that.
So go ahead and subscribe, rate, and review the show. Share it with a friend if you have liked it. But next week, we're tackling the big behemoth of purity culture. So if you have a story that you want to share, a funny or awkward, hopefully clean story from youth group or when you were leading youth group, you can send that in to hello@unlearningyouthgroup.com. If you've got the other ones, sure, you can send those in and me and Eric will have a laugh. But chances are if they're not too terribly clean, we're not going to share them on here because we don't want to have to mark that explicit button on the podcast when we send it out. So that's it for this week. Go ahead and subscribe, rate, and review. If you enjoyed the show, share it with a friend so they can enjoy it too. And if you click the subscribe button, you will get next week's episode on purity culture right away as we say no to the silver ring thing. But that's it for this week. I hope you guys have a great week.
Damn, I'm glad I am weak and high. So, 'cause my best days will be